The court's decision in Roe v. Wade and currents of political and popular opinion, and to try to assess the relationship of the decision to public opinion generally. And for this purpose, we have a great panel. In order, they will be Laura Kalman, very distinguished legal historian from the University of California at Santa Barbara. Then Jerry Rosenberg, the author of the well-known book, Assessing the Relationship Between Law and Public Opinion in the Case of Brown against Board of Education. And finally, we have from the University of Virginia, Professor James Davison Hunter. We're delighted to have all of these people. It's a great panel, and without any further introduction, let's get going.
This panel, which I'm very grateful to be asked to participate in, is entitled, "Why Did Roe Fail to Gain Popular Consensus?" And one organizer asked me to talk about why Roe had not attained the status of Brown versus Board of Education. As a very cantankerous academic, I'll challenge the premise of the panel before I address Roe's reception. The premise reflects conventional wisdom. Jack Balkin begins his book, What Roe Should Have Said, by observing that the most important difference between Brown and Roe relates to the degree of public acceptance each has enjoyed. Like Roe, he says, Brown was hotly contested in the first few years after it was decided. But Congress ratified Brown in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The civil rights movement changed attitudes about race, and Brown was transformed from a flashpoint of controversy into a hallowed icon, symbolizing the aspiration for equality and human rights. In fights about busing, affirmative action, gender and social equality, Balkin writes, people did not argue about Brown's correctness. Instead, Brown's parameters framed the debate, and liberals and conservatives fought for Brown's mantle while condemning their opponents with playing politics with its meaning. Thus, some said, gay is the new black, and same-sex marriage, the last frontier in the struggle for social equality. Roe, Balkin continues, had a different trajectory than Brown. No Civil Rights Act of 1983 ratified Roe's result. Roe energized hostile conservative and religious groups, and many Americans and their politicians still believe Roe was wrongly decided and should be overruled. Since Roe has not become a hallowed icon like Brown, there's that phrase, hallowed icon again, the debate over abortion has continually, Balkin says, raised Roe's legitimacy, and judicial nomination battles focus on its continued vitality. I think that Roe is doing better than the conventional wisdom suggests, and that Brown is doing worse. Certainly, if we restrict our discussion of public opinion to polling data, we would say that public opinion has remained more static about Roe over the last 40 years than it has about Brown. Gallup shows about 55% of Americans approving of Brown in 1954, 87% approval in 1994. But even here, we might challenge the panel's premise by pointing to the consistent majority support for Roe over time. Turn to more informed evaluations, and it becomes clear that the triumphal narrative of Brown portraying it as hallowed icon is in tatters. By the Brown at 40 and Brown at 50 events, Brown, once the all-time feel-good decision, had become a total downer. Or, as Reva Siegel more eloquently puts it, the narrative of redemption we once spun about Brown had become a narrative of betrayal. Some African Americans considered it racist. Justice Thomas says it's contention that segregation stigmatized African Americans, assumed Black inferiority, and Derek Bell came to question the value of integration that he had once championed. Scholars have won fame by challenging the doctrinal basis of Brown since the days of Herbert Wechsler's neutral principles. Then there's the debate about Brown's consequences, with Mike Klarman contending that the decision halted the mellowing of the races, halted the mellowing of Southern race relations, and hardened white resistance. Jerry Rosenberg leading the chorus of disillusioned liberals who grieve that Brown spawned the hollow hope that the Supreme Court could remedy injustice, and critical legal scholars charging that Brown underscored the peril of the rights consciousness that it had made possible. Then there are the complaints that resegregation has replaced desegregation, and that the relationship between academic achievement and desegregation was always unclear anyway. Add the criticisms up, and I think that Earl Warren is not rejoicing that Brown is viewed as hallowed icon. It's more likely that he's spinning in his grave, or maybe walking around heaven with all deliberate speed, wearing a crown of thorns. Lurking behind Brown-Roe comparisons in the conventional wisdom are not just assumptions about Brown, but ones about Roe's reception, to which I now turn, including the ideas, first, that Roe politicized judicial nominations, second, that Roe stopped an evolving movement towards the legalization of abortion then underway in the legislatures, third, that Roe launched a backlash that threatens abortion rights, and fourth, that any movements hoping to vindicate rights in the courts, with LGBT rights being front and center here, should look to the backlash against Roe and rethink their options. While the judicial nominees who dodge Roe ritualistically swear allegiance to Brown, controversial Supreme Court nominations, of course, predated Roe. Indeed, I would argue that the events of 1967 to 71 provide the dress rehearsal for the contemporary confirmation process. Two LBJ nomination battles, Marshall and Fortas, featured the Warren Court as boogeyman. Two Nixon nominations, Hainsworth and Carswell, highlighted the Warren Court's legacy. And Reva Siegel and Linda Greenhouse remind us that the Senate did not ask John Paul Stevens, the first nominee after Roe, one question about abortion. Nor, of course, did Roe halt legislative movement in the direction of abortion. As David Garrow has demonstrated in his monumental study, the battle for reform in state legislatures heated up in the mid-1960s when elites decided that physicians deserved to say when abortion was necessary for therapeutic reasons. Yet despite widespread sympathy for pregnant women who faced fetal disability, only 3 state legislatures had liberalized abortion laws by 1967, and hospitals and doctors proved conservative about implementing those laws. Consequently, just when feminists began to argue that abortion was a woman's right, the pressure for reforming legislation turned into advocacy for repealing it. In the banner year of 1970, legislatures repealed criminal penalties for abortions during the early stages of pregnancy in Hawaii, New York, and Alaska, and Washington state voters approved an abortion referendum. But abortion advocates saw the window of opportunity slam shut as right-to-life activists gained ground. Elected officials proved unreliable allies. There was no reason for elected officials to be anything else. They could avoid the abortion issue, they may have reasoned, and women from their states could go to New York for an abortion. While abortion had become a vital issue for its supporters and opponents, most Americans were neither. During the 1960s, a majority opposed a right to abortion. In the early 70s, public opinion shifted, but support for abortion was soft, as Catholic Democrats knew. So politicians obfuscated, and the momentum for repeal stalled. By 1972, a measure in Michigan that would have permitted abortion during the first 20 weeks of pregnancy was overwhelmingly defeated, as was another North Dakota measure. And abortion foes had enough clout that George McGovern felt obliged to waffle assiduously on the abortion issue, which of course didn't stop Richard Nixon from tarring him as the candidate of acid amnesty and abortion. So it was natural and reasonable that the emphasis should shift from lobbying for legislative reform and legislative repeal to litigating for repeal. Roe first reached the court in 1970 when, to abortion advocates, so much, so briefly, seemed so possible. Then, quite unusually, and partly because of the nomination battles decimating the court, the justices held on to Roe for 2.5 years. Only then did 7 of them announce their majority opinion, treating Roe as a matter of doctors' rights to advise their patients, not women's rights to sexual autonomy. Clearly then, Siegel and Greenhouse invaluably remind us Roe itself could not have created a backlash against abortion. First, polls taken immediately after Roe and since have shown majority support. Second, the backlash against abortion had already begun. Now, Richard Nixon briefly smelled opportunity in that backlash. He aspired to realign politics and create a new majority unified around patriotism, morality, and religion. He originally embraced condemnation of abortion as part of a northern strategy, as part of a northern strategy to lure Catholics from the Democrats, and as the analog of the southern strategy by which he hoped to recruit southern Democrats. But Nixon saw that the 1970 elections did not vindicate his southern strategy. And while he won the Catholics in 1972, pollsters at the time said that it was Vietnam and race more than abortion that brought them aboard. So Nixon retreated from becoming a culture warrior. His Justice Department took no advantage of its 2 chances to file an amicus brief in Roe. The GOP had not yet committed itself to anti-abortion politics, which remained highly contingent, and Republicans remained more supportive of abortion than Democrats. Recall Betty Ford's 1975 60 Minutes interview, hailing Roe as a great, great decision while decrying Roe's perpetuation of the suffering of the helpless, be they poor women or pregnant 12-year-olds. It wasn't until 1980 that new right architects, largely outside the Republican mainstream, people who intuited the potential family issues like gay rights, the Equal Rights Amendment, and abortion to unite Catholics with evangelical and fundamentalist Protestants on the right, hitched their pro-family coalition to the Republican star. But elected officials remained unreliable allies. New right leaders no sooner claimed credit for Reagan's election than they were complaining that he had betrayed them by naming O'Connor to the court. Now, in stressing that the backlash against abortion began well before Roe, I don't mean to suggest that Roe didn't contribute at all to abortion. Law professors, many of them personally sympathetic to the abortion cause, helped make sure of that by launching a new iteration of the neutral principles debate that had divided the elite legal academy after Brown. Think John Hart Ely, who called the legitimacy of Roe into question by deriding the opinion as dangerous. Lochner, Alexander Bickel, Lawrence Tribe, the feminist voices who had added their voices to, the feminists who had added their voices to the chorus, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg by the 1980s and Catherine McKinnon. With friends like you, did Roe need enemies? No wonder Justice Blackmun's clerks showered him with letters and flowers each year on Roe Day. It wasn't just the public's cries that he was a baby killer that hurt Blackmun. It was the arrows of the elite legal academy. But while some law professors didn't help Roe as much as they might have, I don't think that the public cares much more about what you think than it does about what historians do. Elites play a role in shaping public opinion, and had law professors been writing articles and op-eds cheering Roe since '73, it might have a happier 40th birthday. But the public is less interested in the grounds for opinions than what they do. Law professors help to conflate abortion and Roe, but the public cares about abortion, not Roe. So does Roe enable us to say anything about the role of litigation in bringing about social change? As Linda Greenhouse says, everyone cites Roe in the same-sex marriage debate as a way of saying, watch out, don't go there, don't turn to the courts. If you win in the courts, you're going to lose to the public. And indeed, the backlash proponents like Rosenberg and Kalman point to the backlash against the Hawaii Supreme Court's 1993 Bear decision in warning against relying on the courts, though significantly, Kalman, writing in 2012, seems more sure of the success of gay marriage and the value of litigation to the campaign than Rosenberg writing in 2008. But we should remember that gay marriage is different from abortion. It's different from abortion in a number of ways that I don't have time to go into here, most notably perhaps in the fact that abortion advocates have not been able to take advantage of the coming out phenomenon in the way that gay rights advocates have. Now, is it also the case, as judicial backlash advocates might say, that the public opinion needle has not moved as much on abortion rights as it has on gay marriage because the court in Roe contributed to the emerging backlash against abortion by extending the right to abortion beyond the first trimester? 2 minutes? 1 minute, okay. It might be. Still, as a pro-choice optimist, I want to accentuate the positive on Roe's 40th birthday. Yes, I'm outraged about the assassination of 8 abortion providers and Senator Coburn's call for the execution of abortion providers. I'm cranky that Planned Parenthood has abandoned the pro-choice rhetoric. I'm worried that the 4 states with laws banning abortion if Roe is overturned, and the 13 states, about the 13 states that retain their pre-Roe bans. I'm grumpy that Roe was gutted in Casey and that Gonzalez versus Carhart was the first time the court held that physicians could be prohibited from performing a procedure necessary for a patient's health. And I'm angry that before getting abortions, indigent women have to travel huge distances and be subject to restrictions, which I believe are unduly burdensome by violating their dignity, harming them emotionally, and sometimes contravening good science. But the polling buoys me. There are still majority support for Roe. I don't get its meaning. Pollsters ask whether you favor or oppose the U.S. Supreme Court decision making abortions up to 3 months illegal. They don't ask if the public likes the Roe opinion. They don't acknowledge the court's limitations on it. Still, I cheer at the majority's support for it. If the court hadn't intervened on abortion, or had done so differently, might public opinion favor abortion more? Historians hate counterfactuals, and we despise drawing rules or lessons from the past. We stress that the historical context has changed so much that the past lacks predictive value as we look to the future. The story of Roe, like the story of Brown, that is one of historical contingency. Indeed, Roe may provide another illustration that the only lesson from the past is that there are no lessons from the past. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks so much for coming. I want to particularly thank Michael McConnell for putting the conference together and for inviting me. The staff who've worked really hard on the logistics, and particularly Nathan Chapman, who has gone well beyond what I could reasonably expect to help me, including putting together a PowerPoint presentation for me. My children say I'm fighting my way into the 20th century, so hopefully I can make this work. The title of this panel, as Laura told us, was Why Did Roe Fail to Gain Popular Consensus? And in the booklet that you have with the program, we were also asked to address a question and a comment. The question was, what accounts for the uneasy relationship between Roe and popular opinion? And the comment is, unlike other divisive constitutional judgments, popular opinion and doctrine on abortion have not fully aligned. In responding, I will be my contrarian self and suggest respectfully that the question is misframed and the comment is mistaken. I will argue that the question is misframed because the relationship between Roe and popular opinion is much less uneasy than is suggested, and Laura Kalman referred to some of this, and the comment is mistaken as to the role of the court in changing opinions. I will show that Roe is different from other divisive opinions because Roe is supported by public opinion. And if time permits, I will conclude by suggesting some reasons why abortion remains a controversial issue in the political system. I want to start with some recent data. Happily, both Gallup and Pew undertook national surveys on abortion in recognition of the 40th anniversary of Roe. And let's take a look at the Gallup survey. As you can see, the question is, do you think abortion should be legal under any circumstances, legal only under certain, or illegal in all? And a couple of results are striking. We're going back to 1975 here, and one is the relative stability of the views over the 40-year period. Yes, there have been some ups and downs, but roughly support has remained pretty constant. And second, you might note that opposition to abortion has declined over the time from roughly 22% down to 13. Now here's a Pew survey from January of 2013 as well. Would you like to see the Supreme Court completely overturn Roe v. Wade or not overturn? And you can see the not overturn in 2013 is at 63%, quite substantially more than twice as high as the overturn. Gallup asked a similar question in 2012, somewhat different numbers, but a similar kind of response, as you can see. Writing in January of this year, 2013, Linda Saad, one of the senior editors at Gallup, summarized 40 years of data this way, quote, "In the broadest sense, Americans' reaction to Roe v. Wade has been consistent. For the past decades, a majority has always opposed overturning the decision." Now, just very briefly, you might wonder, since Gallup starts in 75, as the first slide told you, what happened pre-Roe. And unfortunately, Gallup and Pew were not asking the abortion question consistently over time, but there were other questions. And what they show, and again, as Laura Kalman referred to, there was a major change in the late 60s and early 70s. In the words of one study, quote, "By the time the Supreme Court made its ruling, there was strong public support behind the legalization of abortion." Judith Blake, writing in 1977, put it this way: "None of our time series on public views regarding abortion indicates that the Supreme Court decisions had an important effect on opinion." And a 2008 study summarizing the data concluded this way: "No decision of the Supreme Court seems to have directly affected the trajectory or structure of public opinion on abortion rights." So what the data show is pretty much constant opinion since about 1970, with majorities supporting a right to abortion. Now, the second reason why the question of why did Roe fail to gain popular consensus, I think, is misframed, is it assumes Americans know what Roe v. Wade is. Now, you may say, oh, come on, everyone knows about Roe. Not so fast. Okay, let's consider some data. Start in 1982, and think of the year 1982. It's nearly a decade after Roe. It's 2 years into the Reagan administration, which had an explicit commitment to overturning the decision. CBS and New York Times asked the following question in a national poll: "Does the United States Supreme Court permit or does it forbid a woman to have an abortion during the first 3 months of pregnancy, or haven't you been following this closely enough to say?" 49% of Americans or respondents said they hadn't been following closely enough to say. Okay, that's essentially half, which was a lot better than the 10% who said, yes, I follow this, the Supreme Court forbids an abortion, all right? And the remaining 41% said permits. Another study, 1986, 13 years after Roe. The question was, Roe v. Wade was a landmark Supreme Court case which dealt with, 9% said, that's easy, that's the racial segregation case. 16% said, I know that's the right of a person accused of a crime. 45% said, Roe what? Wade where? Never heard of it. Okay, and only 30% said abortion rights. Think about what this means. 13 years after Roe, more than 2/3 of Americans didn't know what it was about. So when we have debates about Roe v. Wade, 2/3 of Americans don't know what we're talking about, at least in 86. Now, finally, by 1998, 25 years after the decision, there was a majority, albeit a small one, who knew that Roe v. Wade dealt with abortion. Similar New York Times, CBS study, 55% of Americans saying, yes, the Supreme Court permits abortion, which means 45% either got it wrong or didn't know. Okay, now, given these data, this last result might be grounds for jubilation. We've reached half of all Americans, but it turns out there's an age difference. And if you look at the 18 to 29-year-old group, and this is from the Pew study in January of 2013, a majority of them don't know what you're talking about when you say Roe v. Wade. okay? And that, I think, has to remind us that we live in somewhat of a bubble here. So I think the answer to the question of what accounts for the uneasy relationship between Roe and popular opinion is that the question is mistaken. Abortion rights are supported by better than 2-to-1 and have been for 40 or more years. Now, how does this compare to other controversial decisions? Well, we know from work of people like Robert McCloskey and Bob Dahl that court decisions typically align with public opinion. Now, in part, this is due to nothing more sinister than justices leaving the court and being replaced by justices who are part of the American culture and share broad understandings. However, in several controversial constitutional decisions, the data don't support the claim that the public is aligned with them. And for the sake of time, I'm only going to go through some of them. One is the rights of criminal defendants. The public has never supported the court's decisions protecting the rights of criminal defendants. There's a long literature on this. There are lots of surveys, and they've been consistent going back to the 1960s. Let's take a look at flag burning. 1989 in Texas v. Johnson, 1990 in U.S. v. Eichmann, the court held that burning an American flag as a form of political protest was protected expression under the First Amendment. Well, you can see this question. Do you believe that the burning of a United States flag is an appropriate expression of freedom of speech as guaranteed by the First Amendment, 1998? Nearly 3/4 of Americans say no. Another area, maybe near and dear to Michael McConnell's heart, is prayer in school. We have decades of decisions saying that it violates the First Amendment to have prayer in school, prayer at football games, for example. And as you can see, Americans are pretty strongly opposed to that. Now, if I had time, I'd go through free speech and free press. We have, again, decades of data that show Americans believe in freedom of speech and freedom of press as long as you agree with them, and once you don't, they want to shut you down. And those are consistent and robust findings. So what these data show is that, yes, Roe is indeed an outlier in controversial areas. It's an outlier because there's majority support, and there has been for decades, unlike many of these other areas. Now, this leaves the discussion of why Roe remains controversial, and I don't know what's going to be said this afternoon, but I just want to show you some data here, and I think the answer has to do with the fact that we have a federalist system, and this allows intense minorities inordinate influence. It turns out opposition to abortion is concentrated among certain demographic groups in certain regions, and I want to take a look at who they are. And these data come from the Pew poll. One thing you might think is there a gender difference? And what Pew shows here is pretty much not. There are 3% more women who are supportive of making abortion, keeping it legal in all or most cases than men, but pretty small. There is an age difference, all right? Here you can see as people get older, particularly in the oldest group, is where you get fewer than half of the population supporting keeping abortion legal in all or most cases. With education, people with a college education or more, by better than 2-to-1, want to keep abortion legal in all or most cases. Look at the high school or less. A minority want to keep it legal in all or most cases, and 2 percentage points more people want to make it illegal in all or most cases. Religion is very interesting. On the far end, you have Jews. I believe that's 60. Is that 68? I can't see it. 88, just remarkable, 88 to 10. And then you can see it beginning to drop. But look at white Catholics, for example. 54% of white Catholics support keeping abortion legal in all or most cases, compared to 40. And then you get 3 groups that oppose. Hispanic Catholics, Mormons, and in particular, white evangelical Protestants who oppose it by better than 2 to 1. In another Pew study for which I don't have a slide, Pew asked about views on abortion and controlled for frequency of attending religious services. And what they found among those who attended religious services weekly or more often, 50% wanted to overturn Roe compared to 44% who didn't. Among those who attended church less than once a week, only 17% wanted to overturn it compared to 76% who didn't. And then finally, Gallup reports that opposition to abortion is more pronounced among those with low income who live in the South and the Midwest. So if we put this together, what these polls are telling us is that opposition to abortion is concentrated among older Americans with a high school or less education, with lower incomes, who are evangelical Protestants, attends church weekly or more, and live in the South or the Midwest. Okay, and here's the kicker. This group overwhelmingly votes Republican. Okay, and here you see by party identification, Democrat, Independent, Republican. All right. Now, Gallup routinely asks voters what issues are most important to them. Turns out abortion is down the list, right? You know, economics, foreign affairs are much higher. However, voters who are anti-abortion place much greater weight on the issue than do voters who support abortion rights. Gallup reports that more than 4 in 10 respondents who consider themselves extremely pro-life say that they would only vote for a candidate who shares their views, compared to 23% of voters who say they are extremely pro-choice. And this gives the Republicans a small but a robust advantage. Here I put together some data, and if you look at the, got a little messed up here, the net Republican advantage in presidential elections, it's roughly 2 to 3%. If you look at 2000, 2.4% changes that outcome, right? So what I want to suggest is the concentration of anti-abortion views among certain demographics in a federalist system, and the fact that they vote Republican makes the issue controversial, even though majorities have supported abortion rights for 40 or 50 years. I just want to close with a few examples of this. Take South Dakota. I think it's a really nice example of where an intense minority versus majority played out. And South Dakota is a funny place for this, because in 2008, there were only 2 abortion providers in the state. And in 2008, which is the most recent data I could find, there were 924 abortions, legal abortions in the state. And the South Dakota abortion rate is about 1/4 of the U.S. rate. Well, in 2006, the legislature banned all abortions except those undertaken to protect a woman's health. Pro-choice organizers collected enough signatures to put the issue on the ballot. It was defeated with 56% of the vote. South Dakota legislature came back, adopted a constitutional or an initiated measure, which would add an amendment to the Constitution, which would ban all abortions in the state except for those performed because of rape, incest, or protect a woman's health. And again, that was defeated by the voters with 55% of the vote. Take Mississippi. In November of 2011, Initiative 26, define personhood as starting at conception, defeated by 58% of the voters. Yesterday, someone mentioned that on Wednesday, Arkansas adopted a law banning abortion after 12 weeks. The New York Times story reported that the law was passed by the, quote, newly Republican-controlled legislature, close quote, over the veto of the Democratic governor, and the story noted that the biggest supporters were conservative evangelical groups. Again, in keeping with what the data are showing. Don't know what would happen if it went up for a vote in Arkansas. I'm sure it's going to be challenged in the courts, and it is clearly unconstitutional under the current standard. So my conclusion has 3 points. First, Roe is supported by a majority of Americans, has been since it was announced, because access to abortion in all or most cases is supported by a majority of Americans and has been since at least 1970. Second, in many controversial areas of Supreme Court decisions, public opinion is not aligned with them. Roe is an exception where public opinion is aligned. And third, opposition to abortion is concentrated in an intense minority, which in our federal system is able to exert disproportionate influence given its size. Thank you.
Thank you. Two terrific presentations, and in fact, Jerry, you did most of my work for me, so.
Great minds think alike, huh?
I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction, but first let me thank you, Michael, for inviting me to this conference, Nathan, for all the logistical work. It's a great pleasure to be here. In 1992, I published a book called Culture Wars: The Struggle to Define America. It was a book about deep normative conflicts that permeated our public discourse on a wide range of seemingly disparate concerns, such as church and state relations, funding for the arts, federal funding for the arts, issues of gender, sexuality, abortion, family, the media, and on and on and on. And my question was essentially this: what was the nature of these conflicts? Where did these conflicts come from? Because they seem to be fairly new. What tied them together, if anything? And what did they mean for American society at the end of the 20th century? Well, I continued to puzzle through these questions, and a couple of years later, I published another book called Before the Shooting Begins. The subtitle was Searching for Democracy in America's Culture War. The focus was on one issue in particular. I took one issue of the culture war as a case study, and it was abortion. What was clearly already then the deepest, longest standing, most polarized of the issues of the culture war. And the question was simply this: what does it mean for democracy to address an issue in which the differences of opinion, and thus the conflict, goes all the way down? How does democracy mediate conflict that goes all the way down? The title for the book, Before the Shooting Begins, I put on at the very end. I mean, literally, as I was sending the manuscript off to the publisher, and it was 8 days before the first murder of an abortion provider. This might have seemed prescient at the time, but it wasn't. And the reason is that from my vantage point and from within the field that I work within, what is clear is that culture wars always precede shooting wars. Culture wars always precede shooting wars. It's not that culture wars always result in a shooting war. But you don't have a shooting war without a prior culture war. And the reason is that culture is the form of conflict before the conflict begins. Culture provides the justifications for violence. And it seemed to me pretty clear that with agreement about abortion in the three main branches of government, debate was shutting down. Legal options for the pro-life side at least appeared to be shutting down. And what other options did they have but violence? Okay? I tell this story to bring into relief the cultural dynamics at work that provide a backdrop against which the narrative of Roe v. Wade and its aftermath is told. In highlighting these cultural dynamics, I also want to unpack what may seem to be an obvious theoretical point about the dialectical relationship between law and culture. In that context, I want to talk a little bit about public opinion, and I'll keep my remarks short since Jerry did a lot of the work for me, but I want to take it in a slightly different direction, and I'll conclude with some comments about the politics of ambivalence. Law, of course, is an expression of culture. But because law has its own institutions, its own specialized discourse, its own status structures, rituals, practices, and so on, it has a generative authority and influence. It can be politically significant, both for stasis and change. But because law and culture are dialectically related, it's always important to remember that the law is always underwritten by larger cultural dynamics that are at play. In this sense, the culture always precedes the law, and the articulations and intellectualizations that represent jurisprudence are, in some respects, a legitimating discourse for things that are already present in the culture. My point is this, that we are tempted to lift the law out of its historical and cultural context, thinking that the law is the main thing, that it's the real story, that it is the catalytic of everything that followed. In the case of Roe, there's a temptation to examine its technicalities, whether it had a strong constitutional basis or not, whether there was empirical evidence or not for certain kinds of claims, whether there was legal precedence or not, whether it was correctly argued or not, as though these kinds of adequacies or inadequacies of the decision are the main story. There is a way in which all of that, in fact, is beside the point. Now, I'm overstating, of course, but my point is that there is a way in which Roe, or something like it, was inevitable at some point. Remember, by the late 1960s, the mid-century WASP consensus was rapidly disintegrating. The defining narrative of American history, a narrative of expanding freedom, was being played out in a number of different areas, in the civil rights movement, in the liberalization of sexual mores, and in both high and in popular culture. At the same time, elite culture more broadly, not just academic culture, but elite culture, was going through a period of unprecedented secularization because of the post-war expansion in higher education. There were other large cultural dynamics at play, but one of them was certainly the fact that there were powerful foundations as well as legal interests that were eagerly pushing for the decriminalization of abortion practice. So there are lots of factors, and I don't want to bore you with what you already know. My point is this, that in a context where cultural consensus is weakening and established institutions are losing authority and public trust in leadership groups is declining, the conditions of cultural fragmentation on a wide range of issues, and not least this, were present. Under these conditions, the decriminalization of abortion practice and its divisive repercussions, as I say, was probably inevitable at some point. What was not inevitable was just how divisive the court's decision would be. At this point, Roe v. Wade becomes a story of unintended consequences. Surely the justices did not anticipate the way in which Roe would become the paradigmatic conflict of the expanding culture war, that Roe would become a catalyst for a realignment in the political parties and for the mobilization of the rank and file of these parties. Nor did they anticipate the ways in which it would transform the ideological contours of both liberalism and conservatism, that it would become a symbol of competing sources of moral authority and teleology. The power of this law, the other side of the dialectic here, was not so much due to the intentions of its authors or the logic of the decision itself. Rather, the catalytic influence of Roe was as a symbol that crystallized normative disagreements that were present, even if they were only latent, long before Roe v. Wade was decided in 1973. But latent fragmentation became open polarization. But polarization for whom? Well, in the general population, about 8 to 10%, depending on how you ask the questions, how you look at it, somewhere between 8 to 10, maybe even 12% of the general population that served as the rank and file of the pro-life and pro-choice movements. Certainly there was polarization for the institutions that organized these movements. And there was polarization among the elites who gave voice to the movement's claims. But what about public opinion more broadly? What can be said about those in between those two extremes? Again, on the face of it, we hear that majority opinion is and has been consistently in favor of legalized abortion, as Jerry's figures pointed out. And I saw the same survey data most recently from the Pew Forum. So, just to repeat, the finding that was already mentioned, most oppose overturning Roe versus Wade, and again, by numbers of around 2/3, 62, 64%. And this finding has been consistent for a very long time. Now, I'm a social scientist, and I've done a lot of these surveys. Not on this topic in particular, I have done on this topic, but I've done lots of different kinds of surveys. But as a social scientist, you don't need me to tell you that public opinion surveys are hammers. They are not scalpels. They are the blunt instruments of the social sciences, and they can do as much damage as they can do good. They can obscure at least as much as they reveal. Surveys can be done badly, and they can be done well. And part of the problem with doing surveys well is that they cost a lot of money. So the options given in the Pew data: would you like to see the Supreme Court completely overturn its Roe v. Wade decision or not? One or the other. But most surveys don't ask the question, and again, this is anticipated by Jerry. Do you have any idea what Roe versus Wade actually did? What it allows? What it said? Now, the data that I've seen show that there is some awareness that it has something to do with abortion by some large minorities. But when you actually ask, what does it allow? Do you have any idea sort of what it permits? You're down to 10% of the population. Only 10% of the entire population actually know. This means that popular support, and therefore the public legitimacy of this ruling, is based upon widespread ignorance. The ignorance about Roe raises the question of what public support for Roe actually means. Okay. Now, this is hardly surprising at some level because the American public is ignorant about many things, and which is why one should never use the phrase educated public except with scare quotes. But what the general public doesn't know, they make up for moral feeling or moral sentiment, and these are far more nuanced. It is here where we find a clear picture of the relationship between law and public opinion. And so the question that brings this panel together, what accounts for the uneasy relationship between Roe and popular opinion? I would say that there are at least two reasons, or two factors. And here I think I take a slightly different direction. The first factor is moral ambivalence. Moral ambivalence. There's an enduring moral queasiness about abortion. Though the majority don't want to completely overturn Roe versus Wade, vast majorities of the American public would like to see require doctors to inform patients about certain possible risks of abortion before performing the procedure, would require women under 18 to get parental consent for any abortion, would require women seeking abortions to wait 24 hours before having the procedure done, would make it illegal to perform a specific partial birth abortion, that is, abortion in the last 6 months of pregnancy. Okay? These are at levels, percentages of the population that exceed popular support for maintaining Roe versus Wade. Okay? Now again, we're still dealing with a hammer and not a scalpel. One of the interesting parts of these findings is that the percentage of women who support these kinds of restrictions often exceed the percentage of men. The second reason, so this is about moral queasiness again. The kind of queasiness that a straight up or down question about Roe versus Wade doesn't get at. The second reason that public opinion hasn't lined up behind Roe is what could be called the aesthetics of abortion, at least what I would call the aesthetics of abortion. And I don't want to dwell on this for any time except to say that abortion is stigmatized. And those who practice abortion are stigmatized. Even among people who are pro-choice, abortion is stigmatized as morally dubious, even if it's accepted. And even among physicians who are pro-choice, view doctors who practice abortion as being on the lowest end of the totem pole. Thank you. Okay? They tend to view the practice as low status, disreputable, and those who do them often as incompetent. So 40 years after Roe, legal abortion remains stigmatized, and this is not likely going to change quickly, although it undoubtedly will change. The legal establishment finds itself in the middle of these conflicts, either in ways that intensify that polarization or in ways that try to mediate that polarization by trying to hold our fragmenting social order together through the power of law. But what's at stake is its own legitimacy. Apart from the extremes, fragmentation tends to play out differently in the larger public, not in polarization, but in ambivalence. Most Americans are deeply ambivalent toward the powerful institutions that govern their lives. They're deeply ambivalent toward technology and technological change. They're also deeply ambivalent toward the liberties that they have. On this last point, for example, pornography is legal and freely available, but everyone also knows that it can be profoundly corrosive. Intense violence in film, TV, and other spectacles of popular culture is ubiquitous and legal, but we all suspect that it too is destructive. The same can be said for communications technologies. The social media is entirely legal and pervasive, but we also suspect that something is being lost, even if other things are being gained. My point is that just because something is permitted doesn't mean we value it or find it an unqualified good. After all, even the most progressive parents shield their kids from pornography and violence and even restrict their use of social media. Likewise with the liberties surrounding abortion. There's little doubt that most Americans don't want to criminalize the practice of abortion, especially in the early months of gestation. But this doesn't mean that they see abortion liberty as an unqualified good. On moral and aesthetic grounds, there seems to be an irreducible, maybe even ineffable, yuck factor at play in public opinion that generates an ambivalence that is certainly as great now as it was in 1973, and maybe even greater. And it is this ambivalence that is leveraged at the state level in legislative enactments of restrictions. It is also that ambivalence that renders Roe's ongoing legitimacy at the federal level fairly weak. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Extremely interesting series of presentations. I want to open up to the floor, but before that, I just wanted to ask a couple of the questions of the panel. One which I briefly asked Jerry yesterday, was whether there had been any specific polling on the issue of criminalization itself, which could be done with a fairly simple question, I think. Do you think that women who procure abortions should be sent to prison? Do you think that doctors who help them should be sent to prison? I'm very curious about, I think that question hasn't been polled very much, and I sort of wonder why it hasn't been polled, because that's the actual crux of the legal issues in Roe.
I don't know the answer to that. I suspect the answer is because overwhelming majorities of Americans do not want to send either women or doctors to prison, and so they just don't ask. But I don't know. Does anyone
Probably
know?
more support for dailing doctors than mothers, I would guess.
And again, I think one of the South Dakota laws that got rejected did hold that it would be a Class 4 felony in South Dakota law for a doctor to perform an abortion, and that included prison time, and that was rejected by the voters.
Right. Okay.
That might speak to that.
And I just had one more question before opening it up. As I read the extraordinarily interesting account that Linda Greenhouse and Reva Siegel have given of this movement, the abortion becomes very salient politically and becomes appropriated by the Republican Party in the wake of, in part, the backlash to the Equal Rights Amendment, and as part of a package of cultural issues, which symbolized then the degeneration of traditional values and the corruption and decadence of the culture generally. The abortion on Phyllis Schlafly's list, for example, certainly wasn't the highest ranked item. It was one among many. I'm just curious about how abortion, among all of the issues in that package, became in many ways the most salient one, the one that was most often used as an organizing and rallying cry. I mean, you'd think it could have been, for example, illegitimate births. It could have been divorce, which we hear almost nothing about as a culture political issue. So I'm just puzzled by for Catholics, of course, abortion was an extremely salient issue, but for their evangelical Protestant allies, how did it come? It hadn't been. How did it come to be?
I'm not sure it did. I think that defeating the Equal Rights Amendment was a higher priority, and then once they had defeated that, they turned to, abortion, gay rights, Equal Rights Amendment, they were all part of the same package, but I think for a long time, defeating the ERA was more important to many of the proponents.
Any other thoughts?
Well, I think part of it became central in part because of the way that the discourse was finally framed as competing fundamental rights. These were fundamental in the sense that they are non-negotiable. And once that happened, it was just, winner takes all kind of logic. And it was seen as, in a way, the thin edge of a wedge of a much larger set of packages, you say.
Okay, let's open it up to questions. Linda, maybe you can answer my question.
Well, no, I agree with Laura. I think perhaps part of the reason, I agree with Laura that I'm not sure that Phyllis Schlafly made the link between the ERA and abortion and women in the military and all kinds of stuff, and of course the fact that people have abortions privately but get divorced publicly, is so state after state since those days came to recognize divorce, and you could go on with this, but my actual question is for Professor Hunter. So, of course, you're right about public ignorance when they're asked the big question, Roe against Wade, yay or nay, and you made the point that people don't understand Roe in a very granular way. But then when you went on to the responses, as you characterized the responses to the more particular issues, such as, and you said the public supports informing women of the risks of abortion. So my question is, doesn't an answer to that question also depend on public ignorance? For instance, in the South Dakota law that requires doctors to inform their abortion patients that if they go ahead with the abortion, they will be at risk of mental illness and suicide, actually is false. In fact, there's no medical evidence for that. In fact, the medical evidence is the opposite, that having an abortion to end a crisis pregnancy is actually good for one's mental health. So when you ask a question that comes out of this whole kind of woman protective mantra of the abortion restriction side, aren't you really depending on public ignorance also?
Great question. Thank you. And the answer is yes. And really my point is that public opinion surveys are hammers no matter what. You can't hear this? All right. How about that? All right. Try to use my Maurice Chevalier. Yes. Public opinion surveys are crude instruments of social research no matter what, and they always have to be, in my opinion, triangulated with other kinds of information. One of my points is to say that the more information that you give people, and if you were to give them more information than those survey items reflected, it would have complicated the story even more, which to me, again, leads to a story about ambivalence. Not about clarity so much, but about ambivalence.
I thought the two panels, the first and second panel this morning, just were terrific, both, and they lead me to ask you whether this is at least an accurate way of thinking about it. If you take the three great cases that all three of you have talked about, Brown, Roe, and Lawrence, and you ask why Roe perhaps is the most divisive of the three, if you look at it strictly from the role of courts versus democracy, each of them is an extremely difficult case and probably no better or worse than the other. But only Roe carries with it an enduring moral story of ambivalence where, despite the fact that the court decides the case, it can't decide the underlying moral ambivalence question, and that underlying moral ambivalence question is not going to go away. It can't go away. And my question to you is, recognizing that, how should one behave. If you're a person who cares about public policy, who cares about getting it right from the legal standpoint, when we have and it's a Millsian principle problem. The other two, Brown and Lawrence, you can't tell the story of innocent harm over time. You simply cannot tell how Brown hurts innocent people and how Lawrence hurts innocent people, but you can tell a story if you believe that the fetus is a morally recognizable agent. You can tell a story there about third-party harm. Now, in those situations, what do we do as a culture? How do we answer that? How do we deal with a problem like that, either legally or politically?
I have no idea how to
Boy, am I relieved, because I thought I was really dumb.
advise, I mean, particularly in the, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a sociologist, so I have no idea how to advise public policy or the law in this regard. But your question was not just about the law and about public policy, it was about the culture more broadly. And it seems to me that it's possible that one might find agreement even among the most ardent activists on each side, and certainly in the middle, about the care of young women who find themselves in trouble. Okay? I think there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done on that.
I'll just answer that from the question, from the viewpoint of my pro-choice viewpoint. I think that abortion activists have to do a better job. You know, we all salute Jodie Foster for coming out at the Golden Globes, but who can imagine, as Catherine Franke has said, women coming out to admit they'd had abortions? The only women who come out to admit that they've had abortions are people who regret them. And the pro-life movement has made brilliant use of them. So from my perspective, we've done a bad job in shaping public opinion to influence public policy. That is, abortion activists have done a bad job.
I'd like to actually second both of these comments. In part, when I think about Brown, it's easy to avoid Brown. You just move to your all-white suburb, which is what, tens of millions of Americans did, and it was pointed out, I think, by Laura. Congress essentially endorses Brown in 64 and 65. If you think of Lawrence, we were down to 13 states that banned the practice, so a very different kind of situation than Roe. And to Laura's last point, I worked with a graduate student a few years ago who did a content analysis of newspaper editorials pre and post Roe. And for those of us who are older in the room, if I asked you what was the symbol of the abortion debate prior to Roe, it was the bloody coat hanger, right? It was harm to women. That's been replaced by, I think if one was honest today, the symbol of the abortion debate is the fetus. And so I think pro-choice supporters have lost track of the kind of arguments they used to make, and the question may be, is that a result of Roe turning it into a battle of rights rather than the broader set of issues? So I guess my answer, Bert, is not a good one, but we live in a democracy and we have to continue to have these ongoing conversations, because with Jim, I agree, the law is embedded within that culture. It's not a great answer.
I just wanted to add an observation to the effect that I think, Bert, there's a lot more ambivalence about Brown than your comments would suggest. It obviously depends on what you take Brown to stand for. If you take Brown to stand for the proposition that legally compelled segregation of the races is wrong, absolutely right. There's a complete consensus on that. If you take Brown as standing for what Thurgood Marshall thought it stood for, that is to say, opening the door to integration of the races, there is no consensus on that, and has not been for a long time. Brad Snyder did this interesting study showing that conservative judges cite Brown much more often than liberal ones do, which is kind of an interesting finding to me, and I think they cite it for the colorblindness principle more than anything else. There.
Hi, Elon Werman from Stanford Law School. Thank you all for being here, first of all. My question is primarily for Professor Rosenberg, but anyone can feel free to chime in. I wanted to ask you about this intensity of feeling or intensity of view question. It very well could be that if 10% of the population intensely believes X and 90% believes Y, opposite of X, that 10% can exert a disproportionate influence. But what if 40% intensely believe one thing, 10% intensely believe the other, and 50% kind of sort of maybe, to use a technical term, don't care one way or the other or agree with the 10%. Is that qualitatively different? Does that actually become important? And if so, why is the state of public opinion on Roe on the other side of that qualitative line?
I don't think I want to get into the debate because I don't know how to resolve it about how to weigh different preferences. Do people with intent preferences, ought they as a normative matter to be given more influence, which may be kind of where you're going. All I was trying to explain is why, given majority support for abortion, we still have this kind of resistance. And I think Jim gave one answer with which I actually agree, and I was just trying to suggest the data point to another one. Now, I'm not sure if I'm totally missing your question. It was a little hard to hear. Normatively, I'm sure it's not a very satisfactory answer. I was trying to provide a descriptive analysis.
Just want to respond? Doctor?
I wanted to make two comments. One in relationship to the first discussion about the entity of the fetus or the zygote. And that has to do with the fact that today it is trivial for the blastocyst, which is grown from the zygote for artificial implantation, to be supported. It could easily be transplanted into a Dolly-type animal and allowed to grow into a human if indeed we believe that the DNA that would determine that individual's genetic inheritance comes in the zygote, in the blastocyst. But we are not extending our argument in our discussion of Roe versus Wade to include that. With regard to the cultural wars that have been addressed, I object strongly as a physician myself to the hammer and the scalpel discussion as I heard it, without reference to the absolute murder of physicians who have been providing service honorably, and without acknowledging in this discussion of cultural wars the risks that are real in our society for physicians who, as I recall, we were speaking of their doing things that are morally dubious or stigmatized.
Viewed that way.
Yeah, but if we're going to mention that it's viewed that way, let's also include in this discussion, please, that the now simple medical abortion that any practitioner can participate in helping a woman achieve isn't being addressed quite the same way. And I think that we need to understand how medicine is practiced today and whether or not we are trying to get between the physician and the patient. Thank you.
I'm just a simple trial lawyer. Please let me know whether you agree. And this calls for a yes or no answer.
I'm sorry, sir. Could you speak more closely into the microphone? It's very hard to hear.
Please let me know whether you agree that public opinion surveys which ignore those who refuse to participate are inherently misleading, and if not, why not?
As I understood, the question is, do public opinion surveys that don't count those who refuse to participate, are they giving us data that are representative of popular opinion. Is that a fair restatement?
That's a fair restatement, yes, sir.
Well, I would say, sure, right? If you got bad opinion polls, you get bad opinion polls. The polls I'm talking about have major polling organizations to think long and hard about these kind of issues, and I think can deal with them effectively.
Public opinion survey outfits have really developed the science, and I'll put that in scare quotes too, a great deal over the last 50 years. I mean, since Gallup, 60 years, ever since Gallup, 70 years now?
Long time.
A long time, George Sr. They have ways of oversampling, for getting at response biases, other kinds of things in order to deal with that problem. They're aware of it. They know how to manage those kinds of things. I don't pretend to know the mathematics behind weighting and things like that, but they do, and in ways that are apparently satisfying to even the most rigorous mathematical minds.
Gene Rostow, who'd been the dean of the law school at Yale, just gasped one night at my dinner table, not from the cuisine.
Sorry, sir. Could you speak a little closer to the microphone?
I was just going to ask a question. I wasn't looking for a prostate examination. Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Wow. I'll say, Gene Rostow, when he was the former dean at the law school at Yale, once gasped at the table, and I was explaining to him that under Roe versus Wade and the companion case of Doe versus Bolton, that the right to an abortion extends to the full length of the pregnancy for any reason at all. And in fact, even days after the baby comes out. What did he know? He just read the New York Times. You know, that's how he had heard about it. Rich Derflinger, who tracks the data for years, has pointed out for years that about 60% of the public reject about 90% of the abortions performed under Roe versus Wade. And when you ask the question, are you in favor of removing it? Of course they don't. People are against it because most people, as James pointed out, only about one person out of 10 really knows what's in it. And some of us suggested for Republican nominees to the court that when senators try to elicit their enthusiasm for Roe, that the nominee simply says, you know, Senator, I find many lawyers are not clear on it. Would you tell me how you understand Roe? And as Jerry points out, if you look at the data, you can't find more than like 22, 24 marriages. Only 28% of the public would actually support the understanding of Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton as the courts have had it. Most people are really opposed to it, which was the rationale for our bill to preserve the life of the child who survives the abortion, because people don't know you could have it that late, to roll out a lot of information that people would find jolting. But just as a comment, but just as an observation in response to Mr. Gordon's point. Years ago, I was giving a talk at North Carolina, and I told the audience that I wouldn't expect them to be with me on abortion because I haven't offered them any argument on the matter. But to just, if they could flex their imagination in this way. If I were looking out in the world, in the landscape, and I thought, I had reason to think that 1.2 innocent human beings were being killed each year without the need to offer a justification, where would you expect me to put that in the overall rank of concerns? Would it be just below the level of interest rates, unemployment? Would you really be astounded if I came to the conclusion, if I saw the world in that way, that I couldn't regard this as a peripheral matter, that would have to be a central matter? If the question is, how do you address it? We address it in the same way that Lincoln addressed the question of, why do you consider that black man less than a human being? Give me the principled reason. And we come back. So the question is, why? What is the source of our puzzlement as to why we would consider, people out there would consider this not a peripheral issue, but a central issue if you understand how they understand the case.
Let me wait on that.
Yeah. Okay. Comments, questions? I think myself that the key to answering your question is that for people who see it that way, of course that's how they feel. But they don't for people who see it that way, of course that's how they feel, but they don't necessarily see it that way. And it's pretty clear that over time, the opinions about whether to see it that way have fluctuated a great deal. So it's not an obvious common sense position that everybody would arrive at any point in time. It's extremely controversial, and its intensity varies over time.
Can I add just one brief comment very briefly? I think we need to remember that Roe did not create abortions. I love to put a graph up on the board for my students. On the x-axis I have year, on the y-axis I have number of legal abortions, and the graph looks something like this, and I say, where's Roe? And they all put it in what turns out to be 1970. In 1972, there were nearly 600,000 legal abortions performed in this country before Roe, due almost entirely to state reform actions. And we also must note that even before, since Roe, and probably before, abortion was the single most common surgical procedure performed on American women. That's the context in which we have to think about law.
Hello, I'm just a member of the community, and my point is in keeping with Mr. Rosenberg's, in that I wonder if more women did make public their abortions as comparable to gays coming out, if you think that would change a lot of opinions. If, for instance, the people in this room knew that their mothers, their grandmothers, their aunts have had abortions, if that would change their opinions and perhaps subsequently the law.
I believe so. I came of age in the 1970s living in San Francisco, going to gay bars, because the only straight bar I liked in San Francisco then was Trader Vic's, and it got boring. So I was used to being around gays and lesbians. I'm going somewhere with this. And I'd forgotten how transformative that the experience of coming out can be, until a neighbor recently informed us of his impending sex change. And that made me think of it in an entirely different way. So I think that coming out can be transformative, not just for the person who comes out, but for that person's friends and families. And if more people, if more grandmothers and aunts were willing to admit that they'd had abortions and to talk about them, that would be very useful to the pro-choice movement.
My memory, which may be incorrect, Linda, correct me if I'm wrong here, was that in the reform part of the process in the late 60s and early 70s, many women were coming out. Famous women were saying that they had had illegal abortions, and that put a human element to an abstract debate. Is that mistaken?
Oh yeah, there were events called speak-outs where people would give testimony.
Gloria Steinem.
Sorry?
Gloria Steinem.
Yeah, right. She led some of those, but you know, I mean, you're absolutely right. I had a student in class last year say, I never, you know, I have lots of gay friends. I never met anybody who had an abortion, and I looked at him and I said, well, surely you do, you know. So, but I'll just say, you know, to Hadley Arks and so on, and to Professor Hunter with his yuck factor. You know, the fact is that women having abortions exercise their moral agency and have very early abortions. They don't have babies born alive for abortion. More than 90% of all abortions are in the first trimester. And the ones that are after the last trimester typically are teens who face so many legal obstacles that they live in denial and they wait too long. Or adult women who find in the second trimester that they're carrying a crisis pregnancy medical grounds, or that either for the fetus or for themselves, and have to utilize expensive and difficult to find procedures to terminate the pregnancy. So the notion that women are just sort of casually that we don't really know what Roe means, and women are casually exercising this right is just simply false.
Can I just add one comment, please, about the coming out and more mothers, grandmothers, sort of going public with this? I do think it could be useful for the pro-choice movement, but I don't know whether it would actually change the public regard. Again, the aesthetics, if you will, in the larger public. And I say this because you only have those kinds of changes when an issue or phenomenon penetrates the status structure of rewards and punishments in a society. What the gay rights movement was very successful at doing was in elevating the status of gay Americans, of gay life. It was an upper middle class phenomenon. There was associated with the arts and so on. It in a way was surrounded by by highly esteemed symbols, and that abortion has not been able to do. So I do think it could be useful, but I don't know how it could enter sort of a realm of highly esteemed symbols, and it's just a question for me. I'm dubious, I suppose.
So Robert Self points out that right-to-life groups' greatest and most lasting innovation was to call abortion murder. That reframed the debate. And you can't, whatever else marriage is, it usually can't be called murder. But even David Blankenhorn now realizes that gay marriage can strengthen the cause of marriage. So it's just different.
I fear I'm hearing through a filter, but when I hear that gay marriage, for instance, strengthens the institution of marriage, or that it is coming out as gay is associated with high culture or positive associations, but women speaking of their abortions and telling their stories about the necessities or the thinking behind their exercising this agency over their bodies, I feel that it doesn't give women the status that they deserve, that we are not acknowledging that in making this important decision and acceding that it belongs to the woman in concert with her doctor, that this does not elevate the female.